Here's a powerful hook to begin your speech on the story of the Sudan War. Designed to immediately capture attention and set an emotional tone. What if everything you knew, your home, your school, your street, was suddenly turned into a battlefield? What if the sound of war was louder than your voice? For millions in Sudan, this isn't a question, it's their reality. But through the hearts of the people who've lived it. Would you like alternative hooks, emotional, poetic, or dramatic? Sudan's history is shaped by a division between the North and the South, rooted in ethnic, cultural, and religious differences that go back generations. The North is predominantly Arab and Muslim, influenced heavily by the Middle East and Islamic traditions. In contrast, the South is mostly composed of African ethnic groups who follow Christianity or traditional African religions. This fundamental divide was worsened by colonial rule under the British and Egyptians, who governed the North and South separately, encouraging different educational, legal, and cultural systems. When Sudan gained independence in 1956, this artificial unity quickly revealed its cracks. The people in the South feared that the Arab-dominated North would impose its religion, language, and politics on them. Tensions escalated when the government failed to provide the South with proper representation and autonomy. Southern leaders demanded a federal system that respected their identity, but those demands were ignored. As a result, resentment grew deeper. The lack of inclusion in political decisions, unequal development, and forced Islamization policies made the Southern population feel alienated and oppressed. These fears weren't just political, they touched every part of daily life, including education, worship, and land rights. Northern leaders saw the South as a region to be controlled, while Southerners saw themselves as a people struggling for survival and dignity. Over time, what could have been resolved with dialogue turned into violent conflict. Southern soldiers mutinied, rebel movements formed, and mistrust hardened on both sides. Generations grew up with war as the backdrop of their lives. The divide between North and South was never just about geography. It was about the struggle for identity, equality, and the right to exist with dignity. It was about two very different visions of Sudan trying to live under the same sky. The Second Sudanese Civil War began in 1983 and became one of Africa's deadliest conflicts. The war erupted when the Sudanese government, led by President Nimeri, imposed Islamic Sharia law across the entire country, including the non-Muslim South. This act violated the Addis Ababa Agreement that had ended the First Civil War and guaranteed Southern autonomy. The people in the South saw this as a direct threat to their culture, religion, and rights. In response, a new rebel group formed the Sudan People's Liberation Army (SPLA), led by John Garang, who sought not just Southern autonomy but a united, secular Sudan where all citizens had equal rights. The conflict quickly escalated into a brutal war between the Sudanese army and the SPLA. It wasn't just a battlefield fight, it was a war that consumed villages, farms, schools, and families. Both sides committed atrocities. Civilians were often targeted, and many were forced to flee their homes. Entire communities were destroyed. Over 2 million people died from violence, hunger, and disease. Another 4 million were displaced, forced to live as refugees either within Sudan or in neighboring countries. The war also drew in international attention and support, with different countries and organizations taking sides or pushing for peace. Despite occasional talks and ceasefires, the war dragged on for more than 2 decades. In the South, children were recruited as soldiers, and families often went days without food or shelter. The infrastructure collapsed, and trust between communities disappeared. By the early 2000s, peace talks resumed with greater seriousness, as the humanitarian cost was undeniable. Finally, in 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed, bringing an official end to the war. It allowed for power-sharing, wealth distribution, and the promise of a future referendum on southern independence. The Darfur conflict began in 2003 in Western Sudan, where a combination of neglect, poverty, and ethnic tension exploded into violence. The people of Darfur, particularly the non-Arab ethnic groups like the Masalit and Zaghawa, had long felt marginalized by the central government in Khartoum. They lacked access to education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure, as the government continued to favor Arab elites and ignored the needs of Darfur's African communities. Frustration grew. That year, two rebel groups, the Sudan Liberation Army SLA and the Justice and Equality Movement JEM, took up arms, accusing the government of oppression and demanding better treatment for their region. In response, the government launched a brutal crackdown using local Arab militias known as the Janjaweed. These militias were armed and supported by the state, and they carried out devastating attacks on entire villages. The Janjaweed burned homes, destroyed crops, raped women, and massacred thousands of civilians. The goal was not just to stop the rebellion, but to terrorize the population into submission. As the violence spread, more than 300,000 people were killed and over 2.5 million were displaced from their homes. Refugee camps in neighboring Chad swelled with survivors, many of whom had lost everything. The United Nations and human rights groups described the atrocities as genocide. The International Criminal Court later issued arrest warrants for top Sudanese officials, including President Omar al-Bashir, accusing them of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Despite global outrage, the conflict dragged on for years with few lasting solutions. Peace agreements were signed and broken. Many militias continued to operate with impunity, and violence remained a part of daily life in Darfur, even today. The region struggles with insecurity, displacement, and a deep sense of injustice that has never truly. Omar al-Bashir came to power in 1989 through a military coup that overthrew a democratically elected government. Backed by the National Islamic Front, he ruled Sudan for 30 years with a mix of authoritarian control, religious extremism, and brutal military force. His government imposed strict Islamic laws across the country, silencing dissent and cracking down on opposition. Under Bashir's rule, Sudan became known for political repression, media censorship, and human rights abuses. He used the military and intelligence services to maintain control, imprisoning critics, activists, and journalists. Ethnic minorities, particularly in the south and Darfur, were often targeted by the regime. The civil war in the south continued for most of his early years in power, and when the Darfur conflict erupted, Bashir responded with overwhelming force. His government was accused of arming the Janjaweed militia and enabling the mass killings that took place in Darfur. In 2009, the International Criminal Court issued a historic arrest warrant for Bashir, charging him with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the first sitting head of state to face such charges. Despite this, Bashir remained defiant, traveling freely to countries that ignored the warrant and continuing to deny any wrongdoing. Economically, Sudan suffered under his leadership. The nation was heavily dependent on oil. And when South Sudan seceded in 2011 and took most of the oil fields with it, Sudan's economy collapsed. Prices soared, jobs vanished, and frustration spread among the people. Protests became more frequent, especially from the youth and professional communities. In 2019, after months of widespread demonstrations sparked by rising bread prices and economic hardship, the military finally removed Bashir from power. His fall marked the end of a 3-decade-long dictatorship, but the power vacuum that followed would bring new challenges to Sudan's fragile future. In April 2023, Sudan was plunged into a new and devastating conflict. This time between two rival factions within the country's own security forces. On one side stood the Sudanese Armed Forces (SAF), led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the country's de facto ruler. On the other side was the Rapid Support Forces (RSF), a powerful paramilitary group led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, widely known as Hemeti. Both men had once been allies during the transitional period that followed the fall of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, but a bitter power struggle between them turned violent. The fighting began in the capital Khartoum, with both sides using heavy weapons, airstrikes, and artillery in densely populated areas. Civilians were caught in the crossfire almost immediately. Homes, hospitals, markets, and schools became battlegrounds. Food and medicine ran short. Electricity and water were often cut off. For days, over 1 million people fled Khartoum alone, and the violence quickly spread to other parts of the country, including Darfur, where ethnic attacks resurfaced. Armed militias took advantage of the chaos, looting and killing with little resistance. The international community called for ceasefires, and several were announced, but none held for long. Each side accused the other of breaking the truce, and both refused to step down or compromise. As the weeks turned into months, the humanitarian situation worsened. The health system nearly collapsed. Refugees poured into neighboring countries, like Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan. Thousands were killed, and millions were displaced. The conflict exposed the fragile state of Sudan's transition to democracy, which had already been undermined by military interference and political instability. What began as a rivalry between generals became a national tragedy, with ordinary people paying the highest price for a war they never chose. The ongoing suffering in Sudan is a result of decades of conflict, political instability, and economic collapse that have left the country deeply scarred. Even after peace agreements and regime changes, the lives of ordinary Sudanese people have not improved. Millions are still displaced from their homes, living in overcrowded refugee camps or makeshift shelters with limited access to clean water, food, and healthcare. Entire generations have grown up knowing only war, and many children have never been to school. Malnutrition is widespread, especially among infants and young children. As food insecurity worsens with every new wave of violence, the healthcare system is nearly non-functional in many areas, with hospitals destroyed or abandoned and medical staff unable to work safely. Women and girls face increased risks of sexual violence, exploitation, and forced marriages in the chaos. The economy, once heavily dependent on oil revenues, collapsed after the secession of South Sudan in 2011. Inflation soared. The currency lost value, and basic goods became unaffordable for most families. Many have lost their jobs or are forced to work under dangerous conditions just to survive. Humanitarian aid has been hampered by the fighting, with aid workers unable to reach those in need or being targeted themselves. Meanwhile, the political process remains frozen. Civilians who once protested for democracy and freedom have been sidelined, while rival military leaders continue to fight for power. International pressure and peace negotiations have produced little lasting progress, and many Sudanese feel abandoned by the world. The suffering is not only physical, but emotional and psychological. Trauma, grief, and fear have become part of daily life. Despite everything, the Sudanese people continue to show remarkable resilience, holding on to hope for a day when peace, justice, and dignity will return to their homeland. Here is a heartfelt and powerful conclusion to your entire speech on the story of the Sudan War. The story of the Sudan War is not just a tale of battles and borders, it is a story of pain, courage, and the enduring spirit of a people who have faced generation after generation of loss. From the deep divisions between North and South, to the horrors of Darfur, to the betrayals of dictatorship and the devastation of the 2023 conflict, the Sudanese people have endured what many cannot imagine. But even in the darkest hours, they have not lost their humanity. They continue to hope, to rebuild, to teach their children, and to pray for a future that is free from fear. This war has left scars that cannot be erased, but within those scars lies the truth that the people of Sudan deserve peace, justice, and the right to live with dignity. Their story must not be forgotten, because it is not just Sudan's story, it is a mirror of what happens when power is placed above people, and it is a reminder of what can be achieved when compassion, unity, and understanding lead the way forward.